Bruce Bonyhady is often referred to as the father of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. A former Treasury economist and investment banker with the lived experience of having two disabled sons, Bonyhady was a key player in turning the NDIS from a vague idea at Kevin Rudd's 2020 summit into a reality.
In this bill, we see Australia at its very best.
We're asking Australians to chip in for this compassionate cause.
There are obvious issues with the way that the scheme is being administered.
The NDIS now serves a much larger number of people than ever envisaged, some 610,000, including children with developmental problems, but not as it should.
The NDIS is not working for everyone. We must stop thinking of the NDIS as though it is a limitless magic pudding.
Amid increasing alarm at the scheme's financial unsustainability, NDIS Minister Bill Shorten last year commissioned Bonyhady and retired senior bureaucrat Lisa Paul to review it. They will present their final report next month. But Mr Bonyhady has already been blunt about some of the changes that need to take place.
It is an oasis in the desert for people with disability.
It had always been envisaged the NDIS would act in conjunction with existing services provided by state and local governments. But the provision of these other services has instead declined or stopped altogether. Then there is the biggest cost blowout and the biggest change in the scheme, in early childhood.
This is an area that needs a complete and urgent rethink.
About 11% of boys and 5% of girls aged 5 to 7 are in the NDIS. The most common reasons children are on the scheme are autism and developmental delay. The most controversial recommendation by the review may be that most of these children should be supported in places like early childhood centres and schools instead of the NDIS. Professor Bruce Bonyhady is the co-chair of the NDIS Independent Review. Bruce Bonyhady, in your speech today, you note that every government in Australia, including local councils, agreed to make their mainstream services more accessible to disabled people. But in fact, we've ended up with less services and less access. What's missing now?
Over the last 10 years, all governments have prioritised the NDIS and it's led to extraordinary benefits for people with disability. But in the speech today, I pointed out that the NDIS is only for approximately 1 in 50 Australians when 1 in 5 Australians have a disability. And instead of investing in those foundational supports, governments have prioritised the NDIS. Now, that's all very understandable, but we need those foundational supports for people with disability to be equitable and for the scheme to be sustainable. And so we need an additional set of services, foundational supports for adults with disability, so that they've got information, peer support, and in some cases, access to services a bit like the old home and community care system. And then for children, we need much better supports in maternal and child welfare centres, in integrated child and family centres, so that developmental delay and developmental concerns are picked up as soon as possible, and these children get support in those natural settings while their brains are as plastic and pliable and best able to benefit from early intervention. And that then extends to access to mainstream services such as health and education and housing, so that all of these services are accessible to people with disability. And as a result, there's not excessive pressure on the NDIS, which is what we've seen develop over the last 10 years.
How realistic is it to think that state and local governments will open themselves up again to that sort of expenditure?
In the absence of that support system, support for people with disability won't be fair, it won't be equitable, and ultimately the NDIS won't be sustainable. So what we're really saying to all governments is that investments in foundational supports are a bit like preventative health care. They're smart investments that provide for better outcomes for people and at the same time lead to minimum costs to government, which is ultimately what an insurance approach is about. So we need that additional system sitting side by side with the NDIS, which was always the intention of governments. But in prioritising the NDIS, that other vital and essential part of the system hasn't been built. And to codify it, we need a new intergovernmental agreement to make clear who is going to be responsible for what, and that people with disability are properly supported.
So your most contentious recommendation is likely to be that children with development issues should be properly assisted through existing mainstream bodies like early childhood centres and schools, rather than getting individual packages through the NDIS. How do you ramp up those services? For example, ensure there are specialised skills in classrooms to help? And how do you reassure parents who've got their kids into the NDIS that, because it is that oasis in the desert, that who'll be reluctant to give it up?
The overwhelming feedback we've received through this review is that families want their child supported in the settings where they normally live and are educated. And so this is simply the feedback that we've got from families. In some cases, that support will be best provided just through these foundational supports. In other cases, where the level of disability is much greater, then they may need access or will need access to the NDIS and its early intervention packages. But again, what we would say is that early intervention needs to be provided in those natural settings, in homes and in maternal and child welfare centres, in child and family centres, in early education centres, so that these kids are supported in those environments rather than in clinical environments. And the evidence in relation to best practice in this area is very clear that that is the best way to support these children.
You've said that the long-planned market for NDIS services is not delivering enough of the right supports in the right locations. That sounds like market failure. What does the government need to do to fix that?
I think the point to note is that in the NDIS marketplace today, there are now more than 140,000 unregistered providers. It doesn't mean that those unregistered providers are bad. In some cases, unregistered providers are providing some of the most innovative services. But we've also heard about how some of those unregistered providers are exploiting people with disability with large funding packages. What we need in this market is a system of proportional regulation that ensures that the most vulnerable people with the most complex needs, and particularly those who are living in settings that are not particularly open, are properly protected. And in that way, I think governments need to steward the market. The other part that is important here is there needs to be a much stronger focus on the training of the NDIS workforce. And one of the points that we've recommended is that there needs to be a training quotient that travels with these workers, because most of them are employed casually, to make sure that we lift the level of support and quality right across the system.
Bruce Bonyhady, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thanks so much, Laura.